What would you do if a wild bobcat kitten walked out of the pines and took a bite of your sandwich, then came back with 4 siblings? In the thawing silence of a Maine bog, a widowed librarian meets a fearless bundle of spots, and a rule she swore to keep: never interfere. Shatters when a flash flood turns rescue into a race against death. Why does the mother bobcat step closer instead of vanishing? What gift does she lay at human feet, and what farewell is written across a sunset ridge? Stay, because this isn't just wildlife. It's a pact, a heartbeat, a second chance at family. The woods held their breath at daybreak. Along the fringe of Baxter State Park, snow thinned to lace, and the bog wore a glaze of light. In the hush, Evelyn Hartley stood with a camera against her parka, watching steam lift from her thermos. March had not decided whether to be winter or spring. Ice clicked in the cattails. A crow wrote a black note across the pale sky. At 59, Evelyn knew this clearing the way a reader knows a margin. She had broken a path to it all season, snowshoes biting down between spruce and birch until the trees opened. She knelt by a hummock, set the tripod, and let the forest settle. Patience came easily to a retired school librarian. Silence, too. But lately, the quiet had a different weight, as if someone had taken a book from the shelf and left a space she kept noticing. 3 years earlier, her husband had gone out in a ranger's green during a sudden storm and never walked back. Since then, Evelyn carried a small notebook the way other people carried keys. "Dear Paul," began nearly every page. She wrote him the weather, the names of unseen birds, the taste of mornings without his boots in the hallway. She did not show the notebook to anyone. Some things were easier to bear inked on paper. What drew her today was a white roomer, a snowy owl twice seen hunting low over the bog at dawn. She set the lens toward the cattails and tuned out the crows. The camera steadied her heartbeat. Through glass, the world divided into color and line: lilac shade on drifted snow, a green hint under crust, a zigzag of vole-track stitched like mending. Waited, she had written yesterday. Today, she wanted the word to mean more than absence. She sipped coffee, then opened her lunch tin, an old habit her daughter teased her for. Inside sat a turkey sandwich on homemade bread, an apple, a square of gingerbread. She wrapped half the sandwich and left the other half in the tin, a small courtesy to a morning that had kept her company. Wind teased the pines without truly moving them. The clearing offered familiar sounds: a tiny creak of thawing ice, the whisper of needles, the far rattle of a woodpecker. Evelyn matched her breathing to the place. She had practiced being unseen so well that some days she worried she might pass herself without noticing. Out here, invisibility was a skill. At home, it could feel like loss. Still, the forest repaid attention. A thread of sun slid between trunks and turned the bog skin to glass, then faded. A tuft of fur on blackberry cane told a short story of a fox. She adjusted the focus, then took her hands away and listened. Crunch. She did not move. The sound was close, light, a small weight testing the snow, not the firm thud of a deer, not the scribble of a squirrel. Another pause, then a second, nearer footfall. Evelyn lowered her lids until the world narrowed. Her mitten hovered above the camera and then stopped. Sometimes the truest photograph was the one you took by staying still. Her heart lifted, not with fear, but with the surprise of being chosen by a moment. The owl, if it came, would be a clean white fact. But something else was approaching. Ordinary and remarkable at once, like a sentence that begins quietly and ends by changing the page. She set the coffee lid into the snow and waited, every sense open. The forest listening with her. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Closer. Evelyn shifted only her gaze toward the pine thicket, rehearsing the usual suspects. Fox, rabbit, maybe a grouse. Instead, the snow parted and set down a small, tawny body with frost-kissed whiskers and a tail, a blunt punctuation mark. A bobcat kitten. It was the size of a house cat with the wrong kind of feet. Broad, furred, winter-made. The kitten flowed across the crust, testing, correcting with small hops when a paw broke through. Within 5 feet it stopped, ears cupped toward her as if gathering her breath into a bowl. Its eyes, the color of thawing ice, held more curiosity than fear. Evelyn did not reach for the camera. She softened her face, let her hands rest open on her knees, and willed her heartbeat to quiet. From the open lunch tin at her side rose a domestic warmth, homemade bread, turkey, mustard, a sliver of apple sweet with cold. The kitten's nose worked like bellows. It leaned left, then right, mapping the air as if it were a page to be read. Rules gathered: never feed wildlife. Where there is a kitten, there is a mother. Do not tangle your life with the woods, arithmetic. She heard her husband's ranger voice, calm as a metronome. She also heard a different sound she had not heard much since. Laughter, small and possible, waiting to be invited. The kitten advanced, found its reflection wavering in the stainless thermos lid, and flinched at the impostor. 2 crystals of snow shook loose from its whiskers. Evelyn's mouth tilted. She pinched off a corner of sandwich, the bread yielding against her glove, and inched her hand forward along the snow the way one slides a letter across a counter. No coaxing words. No movement above the wrist, only patience. The kitten stretched until its whiskers touched her knuckles. It sniffed, retreated a finger's width, then sneezed, an adorable spark that sent a crumb spinning and startled it backward exactly 1 step. Evelyn's laugh arrived unannounced, bright and brief, like a window opening. The kitten recalculated. Courage eclipsed caution. With tiny, precise teeth, it took the morsel without touching her skin, then pivoted and scampered toward the thicket, tail flagging victory. She did not pursue the moment with her lens. She let it ring. Warmth moved through her the way sap rises when sun climbs a winter tree. She touched the place on her glove where the whiskers had tickled and found joy there, undeniable. The thicket absorbed the kitten, and the clearing resumed its modest labours, a woodpecker marking time beyond the alders, a seam of ice cracking then healing, wind threading pine needles without moving them. Evelyn waited because waiting was familiar, but she was no longer waiting only for the owl. She was listening for the footstep of possibility. She drew her notebook from her pocket and wrote beneath the date, mitten clumsy on pencil. Sprig came. The name fit the instant she wrote it. New growth after a hard season, a green insistence under snow. She added, fearless as April, sneezes like a spark. She looked up again. Ordinary had shifted. The sky wore the same pale silk. The bog kept the same cold mirror, yet a hinge had turned. One kindness offered, one wild trust accepted, and her day changed. The owl could wait for another morning, she decided today. Before packing, she pinched off another crumb and set it by her boot. Not bait, not bargain. A quiet thank you. If wind took it, fine. If a jay claimed it, better. If soft feet returned, she would practice stillness again. At last, she stood. Blood prickled her knees awake. She slung the camera and followed her stamped path toward the road. At the birch curve, she paused and glanced back. Nothing moved in the thicket. She smiled anyway. Dear Paul, she would write tonight. A bobcat child ate from my hand. He sneezed. I laughed. For a little while the woods did not feel so empty. She imagined the old softening at the corner of his mouth and tucked the thought away like a letter, then walked on carrying the gentlest proof that some silences are waiting to be answered. All week, the memory of the sneeze stayed with Evelyn like a seed in her pocket. When a hard freeze came under high cloud, she packed the same lunch plus extra crusts and torn turkey, slid a fresh card into her camera, and tucked a pocket recorder beside the apple. At the clearing, she set the tripod toward the thicket. The owl did not appear. She breathed, staying still. Then came plural crunches, tiny drumbeats under the pines. Evelyn stilled, palms warming her boots. From the brush stepped Sprig, whiskers frosted, brisk with purpose. He checked over his shoulder as if leading someone, and the thicket obliged. 4 more kittens, a tumble that separated into selves. The first was smaller, with a rounder face and a hind foot that argued with the crust. He tripped, righted, and pressed close to Sprig, apology given by leaning. Moss, she thought, because the word felt soft enough to hold him. A sleek kitten slid next and paused where shadow met light. He set each paw the way a careful reader sets each word, ears rotating to sample the clearing. Ash, she named him, for the cool intelligence behind his gaze. Mischief followed, a narrow-faced kitten with a tail that telegraphed opinions fixed on the dangling strap of her camera, crept with theatrical stealth, wiggled and pounced, worrying the weave as if the day had a zipper. Thistle, she decided, prick and charm in the same breath. The last was Weather in Fur. He darted, doubled back, discovered his tail, abandoned it for a flake, sprang, missed, chased the shadow of his leap, and arrived panting at her knee. Fennel, she thought, because the name tasted fast. 5. Sprig at the head, Moss snug alongside, Ash assessing, Thistle stealing, Fennel streaking. Evelyn lowered her face into a quiet smile. The kittens rearranged as if composing a sentence. Moss climbed the toe of her boot, slid, and tried again, claws making a soft, zippering sound. When he reached the laces, he parked and hummed. Thistle abandoned the strap for the loose end of her scarf, tugged, reversed, tugged again, satisfied by the fabric's stubborn give. Fennel found the lens cap, batted it, sent it skating, chased, overshot, and returned, thrilled that it was still round. Ash paced a careful circle, cataloguing distance and exit. Evelyn eased open the lunch tin, pinched off crumbs small enough to be tokens, and set them an inch from her boot. Sprig accepted without touching her glove. Moss sniffed, forgot, remembered, and nibbled with the seriousness of a puzzle. Thistle angled in to steal, was blocked by Sprig's shoulder, and returned to the scarf to claim victory there. Fennel looped like weather and checked whether the lens cap had developed new properties. Ash took a crumb only after considering every approach. Laughter rose before she could moderate it, quiet but whole. Tears followed, quick and cold. The kittens paused, then continued, as if the clearing's weather now included this sound. A presence assembled at the edge of vision. On a low granite lip sat an adult bobcat with eyes like bright old copper. She watched the way a cliff watches its river. Evelyn lowered her gaze by a hair, permission to be seen seeing. A name arrived with a clean click. Matriarch, she thought, because the word carried authority without fuss. Matriarch's tail tip ticked once. Ash glanced her way and resumed his survey. Moss tucked closer to Evelyn's boot, a faint tremor of purring travelling through leather. Thistle paraded a loose thread like a banner. Fennel skidded to the bog's edge and returned proud of not falling. Sprig kept order by presence rather than decree. Evelyn angled the recorder toward her knees and the milling paws. The red light winked alive. She did not narrate. The clearing spoke, claws whispering on fabric, the thud of small landings, kitten breath, and snow yielding. Minutes gathered into weather, Thistle practiced ambush behind the tripod leg. Ash performed a clean crouch and sprang at a birch catkin as if precision were reward. Fennel turned objects into momentum. Moss washed his ear and tipped over. Sprig watched all with older sibling brightness. On the rock, Matriarch stretched into a bow of muscle and winter and settled again. She sent one soft sound across the distance, a stitched syllable no human mouth could make. The circle around Evelyn shifted a thumb width, not away, but into a shape that included her more clearly, as if a boundary had been drawn that made room. What she had missed was not only her husband's voice, but the fact of being expected. Here she mattered the way terrain matters, enough to be climbed, tested, trusted for inches of height and a warm patch of stillness. When shadows lengthened and cold threaded her coat, the kittens withdrew in reluctant segments. Fennel left last, dashing back twice as if bargaining for another minute. Sprig paused at her boot, lifted his eyes in a look that felt like both question and answer, then followed the others into the brush. Evelyn exhaled, clicked the recorder dark, and wrote, Sprig, Moss, Ash, Thistle, Fennel, 5. Matriarch, watching, laughter, tears, lens cap, survived, owl forgotten. She packed and stepped onto the path with a camera, heavy not with trophies but proof. In a winter, leaning towards spring, a small parade had rearranged her day, and, for an hour, the shape of her solitude. Mornings learned her name, and she learned theirs. Evelyn woke before the grey, packed the battered tin, a shallow dish, and a soft, clicking thermos. The path through the spruces had hardened into a hallway of snow. She walked it as if reporting for a shift. At the clearing, tracks told on the night, loops of small paws, a deep stamp where something had leapt. She set the tripod, but the camera was only part of the ritual now. She tamped a flat patch by her boots where bodies might settle, poured water into the dish, and watched it smoke in the cold like a small lake. They arrived like learned weather. Sprig first, bright with purpose, Ash at an angle, Thistle already plotting, Fennel like a gust without direction, Moss, small and steady, trailing the group the way heart trails breath. Matriarch took her stone seat and made of, watching a form of ownership. Routines nested inside routines. Thistle discovered the zipper on Evelyn's parka pocket and, with the persistence of a locksmith, learned to worry it open. The first time, Evelyn laughed. The second, she moved the crackers to the other side and added a safety pin. Thistle accepted the new puzzle with pride. Fennel abandoned the lens cap and found a better amusement, Evelyn's knees. He sprinted a tight circle, planted one paw on her shin, bounced to the other, and launched from her kneecaps like springboards. Each takeoff left a faint mark, as if joy had signed its name. Moss specialized in stillness. After 2 curious circuits, he made the same choice. Curl into the shallow hollow she had tamped and fit against her side, the purr starting sooner each day. If she shifted, he sighed and waited. He was learning trust by inches. So was she. Ash revised the perimeter, placing and replacing his paws along an invisible line, pausing to consult Matriarch's eyes before drinking. When Evelyn slid the dish toward light, he waited. When she nudged it into shadow, he accepted. Sprig, meanwhile, stood between Thistle's ambition and Moss's nap, an elder sibling managing traffic. Matriarch watched without moving. After a minute she flicked her gaze, and the kittens lowered their faces to the dish. Tolerance, not trust, but permission enough for water. Evelyn began speaking into the recorder, words more for shape than record. Day 14 of the Bobcat kindergarten, she whispered. Attendance excellent, 1 zipper defeat, 1 knee routine. One nap achieved. She noted where matriarch sat, how the tail tip wrote punctuation in the air, how the dish steamed, how 5 faces lowered to drink. Later, at her table, the audio was breath, scrapes, and one brief laugh. The pattern held when the light changed. On flat grey mornings they stayed close. On gold ones they scattered and returned. She packed extra water, fewer crumbs, sat with palms open, so thistle met skin, not metal. She wore moleskin on one knuckle and called it nothing. Habits were a quiet way to say yes in advance. With routine came new attention. Sprig's patience when Fennel barreled through. Ash's small bow before he drank. The instant matriarch's vigilance softened enough that the air lost its glassy thinness. Permission wasn't spoken, it was a texture. Sometimes she lifted the camera for pause against snow or pine reflected in the bowl. More often, she let the recorder work and kept her eyes free. She narrated in present tense because the present was finally warm. "Sprig is here," she would murmur, "and I am too." The afternoon she understood what had changed was windless and blue. Moss slept on her boot. Thistle negotiated the safety pin. Fennel drew a figure 8, so tight it was almost prayer. Ash looked to the stone and received the smallest nod. And Evelyn, inside the small order that had built itself around her, realized with a start that someone needed her. Not for meals, for steadiness, for the tamped patch, the steaming dish, the knees that could be trusted to spring and not scatter, the voice arriving at the same hour to say the day's name. Since Paul's death, she had been only a watcher, useful to her own remembering. Now, the remembering had company. The warning came in the sky's grammar before it came on the wind. Light dulled to pewter, a band of cloud cinched the ridge. Underfoot, the bog's crust sighed and seeped, small threads of melt mapping toward the channel beneath the alder roots. Evelyn set the water dish and lunch tin anyway. They arrived because hunger ignores forecasts. Sprig, punctual, Ash, watchful, Thistle already testing the Parker zipper, Fennel looping, Moss, small and late. Matriarch settled on her granite lip. The air smelled of iron and thaw. Snow hissed softly as wind stitched needles into thin lines. Evelyn watched the channel. In March, the throat that split the clearing could go from whisper to speech in moments. Today it spoke. Water brown as tea hurried through last year's stems, tugging at shards of ice. Ranger maxims surfaced. Cold water steals heat. Never overestimate your footing. A sound tore the hour, the high, thin yowl of panic. Moss, chasing a tuft of cattail, had wandered onto a rim of rotten ice. The shelf fractured. He skidded and dropped, a small body swallowed by brown churn. Matriarch hit the bank and stopped at the edge, pacing, calling in short, urgent bursts. She crouched and held, muscles burning. The other kittens fused into a tense knot behind her, eyes fixed on the water. The rule rose inside Evelyn. Don't interfere with wild animals. It had been Paul's and then hers, a way to keep the forest whole and herself from making the kind of error you can't mend. She tasted its truth and recognized another calculus. Do nothing and watch him go under. "Hold on," she said. She dropped the tin, slung the camera behind her, and ran. Snow blurred to slush, to slick mud. She angled downstream toward the inside curve, where current softens a hair. The bank broke under a heel. She went to a knee, rose, and kept going. Downstream, a blown-down tamarack made a lattice over the channel. If Moss reached it, he'd go under and be gone. At the alder roots, she hooked her left arm around a woody knuckle and flung her pack into the snow. Moss surfaced, tumbled, resurfaced, a blot of spots and fear. She slid the last shelf and stepped in. The water seized her to the waist. The cold was not a temperature but a force, squeezing the air from her. Current shoved at her thighs. She sank her left hand deeper around the root until bark bit through wool, and with her right she reached into opacity, feeling for fur that might already be elsewhere. He struck her shin and rolled past. She grabbed and closed on nothing. He reappeared, stalled against two sticks jammed into a wedge, and she lunged. Her boots skated. The alder slipped a fraction. She locked her arm, reached again, and caught sodden scruff. Weight shocked her. She had him, lost him, had him again. Her shoulder flashed with pain. She lifted, and the current argued. He came free and slammed into her chest. She tucked him into the V of her coat, chin dropping to make a wall. Now, up. She leaned into the alder, bent her knees, felt for purchase. Mud became a rung. The river took legs. She spread them and found firmness, and pushed, dragging both bodies into snow. She sprawled and let her cheek ice itself. Moss did not move. He was a sodden bundle, limp and cooling. The sound that came out of her was not a word. She rolled him onto her coat, set 2 fingers at the small spring of his ribs, and pressed with gentleness that refused to be weak. 1, 2, 3. No answer. Come on, she said. 1, 2, 3. She lifted his chin, sealed her mouth over nose and lips, and gave a tiny breath. Water dribbled from him. She pressed again. 1, 2, 3. Breathed. The mother's calls soared at the air. The siblings rustled like one anxious creature. Nothing, and then a hitch, a wet cough, a shudder travelling the length of him. He drew a thin, ragged breath. She breathed too. "Good boy," she whispered. She slid him inside her sweater and under the parka, zipped and trapped his narrow heat to her sternum. He trembled. The tremor entered her and stayed. She wedged herself against the alder roots and shook until her teeth felt like sleet. Matriarch stood 10 yards away, off the rock and on the ground, ears forward. She did not advance or retreat. Behind her, sprig, ash, thistle, and fennel hovered in a tight arc, tails low, shoulders high, tuned entirely to the sound of breathing. Steam rose from the zipper. The channel roared on, time separated into minutes, one to breathe with him, one to feel his chest tap weakly, one to notice his paws had uncurled and were pressing faintly into the wool of her sweater. Under her hand, his heart was a bird beginning again. Relief arrived too quickly to name, sharp as pain and then softer. Tears burned and vanished. She pressed her cheek to damp fur and sent a wordless thank you into the small, returning heat. The sky loosened a shade. A crow crossed, silent for once. Evelyn let the tremor spend itself through both bodies. She thought of the blank line in the notebook and knew what she would write. Storm. Rule broken. Life returned. Not philosophy, just the ordinary miracle of a creature breathing where a minute ago there had been only water. She did not move yet. She let his breath stack into proof. She let the ache in her shoulder announce its terms. She let the river go on being a river while she sat, anchored to a root, holding what had been nearly taken. When she lifted her head, Matriarch's gaze did not waver. Evelyn answered it with the smallest nod. "I've got him," she said again, softer. For now, it was enough. Evelyn drove home with both hands steady on the wheel and moss bundled warm inside her coat. The cabin that often felt empty filled at once with purpose. She set him on folded flannel by the baseboard heater and turned the dial low so heat would creep, not sting. A kettle murmured at once. He slept more than woke, breath skimming the line between here and gone. When whiskers twitched, she cupped his ribs the way she once settled feverish babies, her children, now grown. The room stayed dim. Between naps, she touched a fingertip to warm chicken broth and let him lick the shine from her skin, enough to invite his body back. He kneaded the flannel with slow, surprised paws and tucked his nose into the plaid. At night, she dozed in the rocker and woke to watch the lift of his chest, to refill the kettle, to slide the flannel nearer when corners cooled. Once, he released a tiny, involuntary purr, and she cried without sound, startled that relief could be gentle and fierce at once. When he fretted, she hummed the tune she had used for fevers and bad dreams. On the second morning, he stood, wobbled, and sat with pride. On the third, he mapped the room, stove to door to chair, and returned to her ankle as to a landmark. He was still thin, still new to himself, but something uncoiled in his step. She wrote in the notebook, "Moss, present tense, sleeps, drinks, purrs, lives." Outside, Thor pulled at Winter's seams. She wrapped Moss in flannel, zipped him under her jacket, and drove back along the rutted road where meltwater flashed through trees. Courage, she told herself, is often a return. The clearing received them with brightness unrelated to sun. Sprig reached them first, then fennel and thistle. The reunion came as a tumble, noses pressed, ears nibbled, purrs rough with relief. Moss accepted it all, then rested his forehead against Evelyn's knee in a gesture so plain it emptied her of language. Ash circled once, confirmed the facts, and sat facing the rock. Matriarch was not on her throne. She stood on the ground close enough that Evelyn could count the pale tips of her ruff. The mother's gaze moved from Moss to Evelyn and back, narrowing not with threat, but with the work of measuring. Evelyn neither reached for the camera nor spoke. She knelt and lowered her eyes. Wind slid quietly through the pines. Snow hissed along the channel. Matriarch took 2 steps forward, slow blinked once, and then did something Evelyn would replay to be sure. The bobcat lifted a hair by the spine, padded the last yards, and laid it in the snow at Evelyn's feet. Not tossed, not dropped, laid with deliberate care. Then she stepped back and sat. The forest does not write thank-you notes, yet here was gratitude in its grammar, meat placed carefully between lives. Evelyn kept her hands at her sides. She let the gift be a gift, and nodded once. The pact did not make them tame, it made them clear. Matriarch returned to her rock and her work, teaching Ash to read wind, allowing Sprig to hold ground, while Fennel burned energy, letting Thistle fail 3 pounces before the 4th succeeded. Evelyn returned to hers, tamping a warm patch, refreshing water, bringing nothing that would blunt their edges. When clouds lowered, she held her coat like a tent and kept still while warm bodies used her as weather. Moss, already stronger, tucked at her side to watch. The rhythm deepened. Evelyn spoke less into the recorder and wrote more with her presence. She learned Matriarch's soft warning cough and slid the dish away without scrape. She learned signs of schooling, how Sprig waited while Thistle practiced, how Ash accepted a scold without sulking, how Fennel's chaos thinned after a clean, quiet leap. She learned her part, too, to be the steady edge of a wild lesson. That evening, back at the cabin, she opened the notebook and wrote a single line. "You saved one of mine. I see you." She said it without words. She pictured Paul's answering smile and let the room be full again, kettle breathing, clock agreeing, flannel folded for morning, spring unstitched winter until the clearing changed shape. The kittens lengthened into something in between, legs too long, paws landing with new certainty, eyes that scanned rather than stared. spots blurred toward mottling, ruffs lifted like small manes. They no longer tumbled so much as rehearsed. Evelyn adjusted with them. The lunch tin came lighter, the water dish constant. She filmed more, intervened less. On warm days, she set the camera low and let the clearing perform. Her recordings held the grammar of growing. Pauses, sudden decisions, near misses, small victories. Ash crossed the threshold first. Near the vole run he sank, became arrangement rather than animal, shoulders low, tail align. Wind favoured him. The rushes kept still. When the vole showed its careless seam, Ash unspooled, one glide, and a pin, no flourish, only function. Evelyn's shutter whispered twice. The truer sound was the soft exhale of life-changing hands. Ash lifted his head, not proud, but verified. Sprig took to distance. He studied the narrow creek where meltwater chattered under shadow. For 3 days he measured, hopped short, came up wet, and learned which stones lied. On the 4th he gathered and sailed, landing quiet. The 5th day he crossed back, carrying certainty. Thistle refined mischief into strategy. He vanished behind a thrown log, left only the conversational twitch of a tail tip, and waited longer than comfort. When Fennel's curiosity pulled him close, Thistle erupted, cuff, roll, release, ending with Fennel startled into laughter, if laughter can be counted in leaps. The next hour, Thistle repeated the lesson with variations, testing angles like a locksmith. Fennel, all-weather, found a forecast, his loops shortened, his bursts aimed. He discovered that stillness could be a spring rather than a pause, and began to love the moment before motion. Moss stayed near. Strength gathered without speed. He chose endurance over spectacle. While the others ranged, he learned the route between Evelyn's shoulder and hip, the exact shape of the hollow her parka made when she leaned against the hummock. When she sat, he fitted himself to that bowl and matched her breath. His purr deepened, less motor than tide. Matriarch loosened supervision by degrees. She watched from farther stones, her corrections became glances. When Ash overcommitted, a soft sound turned precision back on. When Fennel's glee edged into waste, a look gathered it to purpose. When Sprig's leadership wavered, she merely stood. An authority reassembled. Evelyn's notebook shifted tone. Dear Paul appeared less, not from forgetting, but from addition. New entries read like attendance and field notes. Matriarch, Weststone, Sprig, crossed clean, Ash, first vole, Thistle, ambush improving, Fennel, short bursts, Moss, stayed warm. On some pages she drew diagrams of paw prints and wind. On others she tried to sketch a slow blink and failed happily. She wrote rules to herself. Bring water, not food. Leave before sunset lessons. Make room for wildness to teach. When Moss pressed closer, she let the press happen and did not invent a meaning larger than the fact of being chosen for warmth. She filmed with a lighter hand and a surer eye, following what the clearing already knew. At night, she scrubbed mud from tripod legs, lined batteries on the sill, and scrolled frames where paws, not people, carried the story forward. If grief had been the winter in her, growth was now the thaw, slow, deliberate, not always visible while it happened. Some mornings she listened for silence and heard instead the workable hum of a small society learning itself. It sounded like water under ice, like breath under fur, like her own name said back to her without words again. The path changed before the company did. Snow thinned to sugared crust, then to wet hollows that remembered feet. Alder catkins flushed red-brown. The channel showed a black seam and spoke in a livelier voice. Evelyn walked the old corridor between spruces with the lunch tin light and the water dish sloshing. Habit had weight even when everything else was melting. At the clearing, she arranged the small order as always. Tripod set but idle, dish tamped level, a warm patch pressed beside her boot. Wind moved cleanly today, scentless and sure. She waited for the familiar plural of small steps. Silence arrived instead, not the held breath kind she knew, but the ordinary spread of morning without arrivals. The rock was only a rock, the thicket kept its hush. A chickadee sewed its name into a branch, and a downy woodpecker tapped a small arithmetic into birch, sounds she had ignored when the parade ran at her knees. She made herself listen as if they too were a kind of attendance. Minutes made a shallow bowl. She set the recorder on her palm and let it drink the clearing. Trickle, tap, wing, wind. No zipper worried, no lens cap skated, no weight pressed the hollow she had tamped. The water smoked for no one, and then did not smoke. By the hour she knew. She still waited. Sometimes understanding is early, acceptance late. She stood and walked to the tamarack where thistle practiced patience, to the bog's lip where sprig studied distance, to the hummock where moss slept warm against her side. The signs were there and not, faint, old prints stitched toward the dark trees. A pale snag of fur on blackberry. Droppings collapsed by thaw. Life had gone on doing what life does, moving, choosing, leaving. She did not call. The wordless pact had never included calling. Instead, she poured the dish out beside the channel and watched the water fold her offering into itself without comment. The dish came back lighter in her hand. The next morning she tried again because endings are often plural. The clearing made the same answer. A raven wrote its slow shape over the ridge and vanished. A ribbon of geese passed so high their voices arrived after their bodies were gone. She wrote in the notebook without looking down. Empty, working as intended. Back at the cabin, she opened her laptop and began to ferry the weeks from memory cards into names. Folders bloomed: first sneeze, 5, matriarch, hare, river moss, ashes vole, thistle ambush, sprig, crossing, fennel, loops, water, 5 faces. She let the thumbnails arrange themselves into small, stained glass windows of what had happened and what would not happen again. When she clicked play, the room filled with claws whispering fabric, a brief laugh, a kitten's breath near the microphone. She closed her eyes and let the sound be a room she could still enter. On the chair back, her parka showed a faint set of scuffs where fennel had launched, a constellation of tiny pulled threads. She touched them one by one as if reading Braille. In the cuff seam, a single hair had worked itself into the stitching, pale, almost colourless, strong. She set it between 2 notebook pages and shut the book gently, so it would not blow away when she opened the door next. Evenings were different, but not the same as before. The house carried traces instead of lack. She brewed tea and did not hurry it. She let the quiet sit across from her like someone who had come to terms. When she wrote to Paul, she did not apologize for the change in subject. They came to me in winter, she wrote, printing each word carefully, and left with spring. Perhaps that's enough. She underlined enough, not to insist, but to practice believing it. In the morning, she took the long way to town. At the turn where the logging road climbs, she stopped and scanned the ridge. Nothing moved that she could name, yet the hurt in the empty place had softened its edges. Wildness had done its clean work. It had arrived, taught, and refused to stay longer than it needed to. She did not stop at the clearing every day after that. Some days she carried the water dish anyway, because carrying it felt like keeping a promise to the part of her that had been chosen. When she did go, she stepped in quietly, set nothing down, and stood for a minute like a person visiting a room between uses. Then she turned back on the path that knew her by the way she walked, and let the forest keep the rest. On the last evening, before she meant to shelve the camera, Evelyn drove the rutted road one more time. The sky was rinsed in rose and silver, a weathered postcard of March surrendering to April. She parked at the turnout below the logging curve and walked without the lunch tin, carrying only binoculars and the felt weight of habit. The ridge sharpened against a pale fire. Spruce tips made teeth, the bog behind her breathed like a sleeping lake. She told herself she had come to say thank you to a place, not to bodies that owed her nothing. Even so, her heart counted in fives. Snowmelt talked in the ditch. A faint wind tested the seam of her scarf and moved on. Evelyn raised the glasses and let the world jump nearer. Bark scrolled with lichen, a crow stepping between twigs, the long slope empty and lit from the side. Movement stitched the far skyline. 5 shapes poured from the timber, fluid as smoke drawn through a narrow chimney. Longer legs now, heavier shoulders, tails flicking punctuation at the air. They trotted single file along the ridge crest, silhouettes crisped by the dying light. She did not call, did not wave. She stood still and let time thin. Halfway across, the leader paused. He lifted his head and set his body at a slant, the way Sprig always had when measuring a leap. Evelyn did not need the glasses to name him. The angle was enough. The certainty arrived whole. For a beat the world simplified, her breath, the pinked snow. 5 figures, 1 gaze. The distance refused details, the meaning did not. She lowered the binoculars, so nothing but air stood between them. Sprig held, then softened into a feline almost blink. Not submission, but ease. He turned his head toward the others, touched the nearest shoulder with his flank, and moved on. 4 followed, the line reweaving itself along the ridge and down into shadow. Evelyn kept watching the seam where they had gone until colour fell out of the sky. Only then did she smile through tears, shoulders lightened by a grief that had learned another syllable. Enough. She capped the lenses, slid the strap over her shoulder, and turned toward the road. Tomorrow she would put the cards to sleep and label the boxes, but tonight she carried a quiet, not absence, but a presence leaving room inside. Back home, Evelyn spread memory cards like seeds across the table and opened the small world they held. Clips arranged themselves into a story she had not meant to collect. Paws tapping fabric, water steaming in a bowl, a laugh, a breath restored at the river. She cut away anything that felt like ownership and kept humility, wide frames, soft voice, long moments of nothing becoming something. When she recorded narration, she stayed in the present. Sprig is here. Ash learns stillness. Thistle waits. Fennel bursts. Moss breathes. She burned a copy for the ranger station and another for the little library that still smelled of paste and paper. The rest she stored in labelled boxes: Matriarch, Gift, River Return, Ridge 5. On the inside flap of one box she wrote, "Do not edit out the silence." It was the silence that made trust legible, the quiet that turned footage into memory. Night gathered earlier than the calendar suggested. She brewed tea and set the notebook beside the lamp. The pages had stopped beginning with Dear Paul without her noticing when. Tonight, she wrote him again, not to ask or ache, but to share. "The woods gave me a gift I didn't know I was waiting for," she printed, careful and plain. "I went searching for silence and found voices instead. I am no longer alone." She closed the book and let the kettle breathe. In the corner, the parka still wore a constellation of tiny snags, a map left by Joy. She did not smooth them. Outside, wind threaded the pines, somewhere water kept speaking. Evelyn turned off the lamp and sat in the soft dark, a steady part of a story that would go on without her, and because of her, tonight, grateful.